I have only had one experience using a Ouija board, and that was enough for me to swear off the things for the rest of my life. I had been at a Halloween party with a few of my friends when they told me they had a cool idea and asked if I wanted to come along with them. When I asked them what they had in mind, all I got was, "Don't worry, it will be fun." Not wanting to be left out, I told them I was game for whatever. As we drove away, they filled me in on the details of what they had in mind. One of them had bought a Ouija board earlier in the day. Their grand idea was to go to one of the local cemeteries and see if they could get it to work. So, besides trespassing, they wanted to mess with the spirits of the dead. Besides a dull party, this was on top of my priority list of things I wanted to do on Halloween. I didn't want to look like the lame of the group, so I kept my mouth shut the entire way there. At this point, the worst thing I thought would happen that night was a possible misdemeanor on my record. I kept repeating the mantra, "We won't get caught, we won't get caught," over and over in my head. Still, it did little to settle the nerves that had twisted my stomach into a tight knot. There was several small openings in the fence line on one side of the cemetery, which allowed for easy access. The four of us made our way around the grave sites, taking care not to step on any. Looking back, this seemed a little foolish considering we were there to stir up what we could with a Ouija board, yet stepping on the gravesite was disrespectful. One of my friends saw off to one side a bench that mourners could use when visiting their deceased loved ones. This seemed like as good a place as any for what we had in mind, so we set the board on top of the bench and knelt around it. The ground was wet, which soaked the bottom half of my pants, another highlight to add to this evening. I didn't know what to expect, but when the planchette started to move beneath my fingers, I didn't expect the jolt of fear that went through me. Suddenly, this was all too real, and it felt like we were doing something that we should be. Tempting fate, if you will, we had to come to their home as uninvited guests. Random letters that didn't spell anything at all kept appearing. I think too many things were coming through at the same time to make any sense. With the number of bodies in this cemetery, it was no wonder something like this was happening. All four of us turned to look down the path we were next to when the sound of footsteps was moving towards us. I suddenly had images of me being hauled off in handcuffs and being shoved into the back of a police car. The sound got closer, but no figure seemed to appear out of the darkness. A rustle came from behind me, and I nearly jumped up and ran screaming out of there. You could tell everyone was on edge. We weren't asking questions of the board, but the planchette continued to move around selecting letters. A cold blast of air tickled the back of my neck, and I heard the distinct sound of someone breathing right behind me. Frozen in fear, I expected someone to reach out and touch me, even though I knew no one was there. I was so terrified I would have welcomed the police at that very moment. We'd started something that we had no business doing in the first place. No, I was worried that we had gone too far to go back. Samantha, the one girl who'd come with us, flinched, and the next second she began to bawl her eyes out. All of us just sat there, staring at her, unsure of what to do. With what I was experiencing, the cause could have literally been anything. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I pulled the planchette to the goodbye in the middle of the board and stood with my hands in front of me in supplication. I had had enough of the entire thing. My friends seemed to be in agreement because they were quick to take their hands from the device themselves. None of us wanted to touch the board, so we just left it there on the bench while we tried to keep ourselves from running. Instead, we just ended up making an awkward, fast walk back to our cars. When we were finally safe inside and driven away, Samantha told us that she had felt someone grab her shoulder. Then she described a wave of sadness wash over her that she had never experienced before. One by one, we all shared our experiences, and with each tale, I was sure what we had done had been incredibly stupid. I know the Ouija board is simply a tool, but that night, we used it in a form that it shouldn't. My husband, Alan, and I had just received the news that we were going to have our first child. The apartment that we currently lived in was too small to accommodate the new baby, and we were in the market for a new house. The two of us were looking to get into a place before the baby was born. Thus, we were motivated to get the home buying process done quickly. It took longer than expected, but we finally found a nice ranch-style house that was in our price range. Built in the late 60s, the home had some age to it, but a recent renovation had brightened up the place with a more modern open floor plan. Recently put on the market, we rushed to put in an offer in hopes of not getting into a bidding war with other potential buyers. We were pleased when we found out, a couple days later, that the owners had accepted our price, and after closing, we planned on moving into our new home in a few weeks. This felt like the first step we'd taken to creating the family we had always talked about. Moving day was quick to arrive, and it felt like the two of us were running around trying to make sure everything went to plan. I was sure that we were going to forget something in the chaos, and the stress was making us both short with each other. Still, when we pulled up in front of our home, all the weight seemed to fall off my shoulders. Even though I had driven by nearly every day since we closed on the property, it seemed to exude a glow. The movers made quick work of emptying the truck of the boxes and furniture from our old place. Our new place had a lot more room than the apartment we used to live in, and it felt like our meager possessions wouldn't even begin to fill the space. It was a little comforting knowing that the unpacking process wouldn't be such a monumental task, though. For the first few weeks, it was a bit of a feeling out process. The sounds a new house makes that I wasn't used to seemed to bring me awake a few times a night. Between my fitful sleep and the pregnancy, I was constantly feeling worn down. I was becoming less and less of a help getting everything out of the boxes, but my husband never complained. The day the final box was emptied was one we both felt like celebrating. We went out to dinner and planned on spending the evening watching a movie. Unfortunately, I was still exhausted, and half an hour into the film, my eyes were so heavy, I knew I wasn't going to make it. I told my husband I was going to bed and left him to finish his movie. I was asleep the moment my head hit the pillow. When I woke up to what sounded like footsteps coming from above me, my sleep-starved brain was confused and struggled to make sense of the noise. We had dealt with this same thing for the couple of years we lived in the apartment, and I momentarily forgot that's where I was. I turned over to see if the disturbance had woken up my husband and froze mid-turn. We didn't live in the apartment anymore. It was dark in the room, and my husband's side of the bed hadn't been slept in. The longer I was awake, the more problems with the noise I was having. Our home was only one story, so it wasn't like it could just be Alan walking upstairs, and it was far too late for him to be up in the attic moving around. I had a quick flash of a raccoon running around upstairs and groaned, thinking about what damage it might be doing. I walked out to the living room to find out what happened to Alan coming to bed. As I suspected, he was passed out on the couch with the television still on. I considered waking him up, but decided to just turn off the TV and cover him with a blanket. I knew the pest problem wouldn't be fixed until the next day anyways. He woke up uncomfortable and stiff, but his mood brightened after I fed him some breakfast. It was my way to butter him up for what I was about to ask him to do. Ellen was the kind of guy that was going to try and fix a problem before paying someone to do it. I knew not to argue with him about this because he was more likely to dig his heels in. This was going to be the first time either of us had gone upstairs to inspect what the previous owners had left up there. I was a little apprehensive about encountering some sort of rabid animal, but I was curious to poke around inside any boxes that were up there. The attic's entrance was one of the old pull-down jobs with a hook. I followed him up through the narrow opening in the ceiling where he helped me onto the landing. We both clicked on our flashlights and swept the floor around us. To my chagrin, there were only a few cardboard boxes tucked away in one corner. Other than that, the floor was empty. The other thing that was missing was any sign that an animal had been up here. There were no droppings anywhere, and the floor was covered in a thick layer of dust on which a track would have been easily seen. Alan must have been thinking the same thing because he seemed to come to the same conclusion that there wasn't anything up here. "Don't look at me like I'm crazy. I know what I heard," I told him. He wiggled his fingers at me. "Ooh, maybe this attic is haunted and it was a ghost you heard up here." He was trying to be funny, but I wasn't amused. He got that really quickly after seeing the face I made, and to apologize, helped me carry down the few boxes we'd found. He set the boxes on the ground in the living room and left me to hunt through them. The first of the boxes held nothing more than a few empty picture frames and a couple of old books. In the second one, though, I hit the jackpot. An old Ouija board and a planchette had been wrapped within a sheet. There were a few chips and scratches here and there, but otherwise it was in pretty good shape given how old it appeared. At this point, the last box had lost all interest for me. I'd asked Alan to try it out with me, but he didn't believe in ghosts or spirits, so it would have been a waste of time. I did, however, have my friend Angie, who was really into this kind of thing and would jump at the chance to use it with me. A quick phone call confirmed this, and we made plans to get together that night. Alan didn't want to be any part of our imaginary friends, so he and a couple friends went out to have an evening of their own. That just left me and Angie alone so we could concentrate without having to listen to his snide remarks. This hadn't been the first time the two of us had used a Ouija board, but we were wary of this one in particular. I knew well enough that objects can absorb the energy from a spirit. When dealing with an object like this that is used to channel spirits, it is even more likely. To take precaution against any negative energies that may be attached, we burned white sage over it. We started by introducing ourselves and telling any spirits that were present that we were there to listen to them and offer our assistance if we could help. We moved the planchette in a circular pattern and then stopped it in the center of the board to wait for any message that would come through. There was only a slight pause before the planchette began to move. Sometimes when using a Ouija board, the message is tough to understand, but when we finished, it was clear what the spirit was trying to tell us. GETOUT. The only question I had was why it wanted me to leave. When we asked the spirit again, it gave us a direct answer. MINE. Now, as much as the spirit would have liked us to comply with its wishes, which wasn't going to happen, this was my house now. As I saw it, that left me two options. 1, deal with the spirit living in my house, or 2, find a way for the spirit to move on. I didn't see a positive side to keeping the energy around that didn't want me here, so I chose option 2. We tried with the Ouija board to ask the spirit why it wouldn't leave, but all we got was a series of unintelligible letters that didn't seem to mean anything. Angie and I took this as the spirit was frustrated with us, not agreeing to do as it asked. At this point, I told the spirit directly that I had no intention of leaving. When I said this, I heard a distinct knocking sound above us. "Is that you making that noise in the attic?" I asked, to which the planchette moved to the word yes. Given what we had already been told, I figured it was safe to assume this had been the spirit who had woken me up the night before. I looked over to Angie, hoping that maybe she would have an idea as to where we should go from here. She thought for a moment and then spoke. "Is there something of yours that's still here that's keeping you here?" The planchette moved again to the word yes. Angie continued. "Something that belonged to you?" Again, yes. She looked over to me, and I shrugged. The only things I had found was the Ouija board and a few old picture frames. The idea that these things were keeping someone there seemed odd. Then I remembered there had been a third box that I hadn't looked through. I told Angie I'd be right back and brought back the box that I hadn't looked through yet. There were a few old dolls that had seen better days, but at the bottom was a small jewelry box. I gently picked it up and opened the lid. Inside was a gold ring. It looked like one a man would get on his wedding day. If this was the case, it would be a deeply personal object and just the kind of thing that a spirit could attach to. The only thing we had left to do was ask the spirit if this was his or her ring. When we did so, the planchette immediately went to the word yes. It did this at least 4 times as if to punctuate the response. Now that we assumed we figured out the source of the spirit, we had to do something about it. I could only think of one thing: return it to the family who it belonged. We moved the planchette to the word goodbye and thanked the spirit for communicating with us, ending the session. The following day, I called the real estate agent and asked them to get in touch with the family whom we bought this house from. I told her that I believed they left something of value behind and I wanted to return it to them. A young man called me a few days later and did in fact confirm that the ring had belonged to his father, who lived in this house until he died. We made plans to meet up so I could return it. Up until the day that I returned the ring, I would still hear what sounded like footsteps and creaking coming from the attic. Afterwards, though, it has completely stopped. I wonder how long it would have gone on before I figured out what was happening if I hadn't found that Ouija board that day. A few years ago, my wife of 36 years, Evelyn, died suddenly of a brain aneurysm. The doctors told me that there was nothing anyone could have done to save her. Thankfully, she passed in her sleep and simply didn't wake up. For this, I was very thankful, but it left me with a lot of unresolved feelings. I just couldn't move on with my life. Even our room had been left untouched since that day, like some kind of shrine to her. Our kids had been pushing me to get rid of her things, but it was just too painful. She had been the love of my life, and I just wanted her back. Those things were my way of holding on. Finally, at a loss for what to do, my daughter, Susan, suggested maybe I try and use a Ouija board in hopes of getting the closure I so desperately wanted. I'm not a person who subscribes to the supernatural aspects of life and was initially against such a thing. She pressed me, though, and finally, just to get her off my back, I agreed to try it. Our anniversary was just a few weeks away, the first one since her passing, and I wasn't looking forward to it. Susan thought it was the perfect day to attempt communication because of the significance to both of us. I brought up some of my previous arguments against it, but again, my reservations were overcome by her persistence. The date was set, and it seemed that we were going to do this whether I liked it or not. As the date approached, I found myself growing more anxious at the prospect of talking to Evelyn again. It almost felt like I did when we went on our first date all those years ago. I didn't really know what I was supposed to wear for this sort of thing, so I put on a casual suit thinking it would be appropriate. When Susan arrived at my door wearing jeans and a t-shirt, I felt grossly overdressed. Her scrunching up her face and looking at me up and down didn't help matters either. We had a nice dinner, and after we cleaned up, she brought out the board. I had seen Ouija boards before in the stores, mass-produced pieces made by game companies. This wasn't one of those. Susan had brought with her an intricately painted wooden board and a planchette with a glass eye that would be used to indicate what letter the supposed spirit had selected. She told me that it was her own personal board and thought it might help us with what we were doing. The revelation that she owned such a thing was a surprise to me, but given that she had been the one to suggest this, I guess I shouldn't have been. We set up the board on top of the coffee table in the living room. After turning off the lights and lighting a few candles, we sat on opposite sides of the table from one another and prepared to begin. She told me that it was important for me to take this seriously, otherwise it would possibly keep us from getting the messages we were here to receive. Susan asked me if I wanted her to direct the interactions. At this point, all I could do was nod affirmative. I admit that I was afraid, not of what we were doing, but that Evelyn wouldn't show up. I had gotten my hopes up so high, if nothing happened, it would be a huge disappointment. We placed our hands on the planchette, and Susan started off by making several figure 8 patterns with it and stating that we had gathered with good intentions. In a commanding voice, she said that no negative energies were welcome and that we were there to communicate with Evelyn, her mother, and my wife. She asked her to come forward in order for those of us left behind to gain the closure that we all need. The two of us sat there and waited for what seemed like a long time, but my faith in Evelyn kept me from throwing my hands up in frustration. Susan reached out again, imploring her to come and speak with us, yet the planchette still didn't move. I was losing hope. I looked up and met my daughter's eyes. I could see how much this was hurting her, too. I never meant to say anything during this whole thing, but I felt compelled to speak up. Ev, sweetheart, it's me. I don't know if you can hear me, but I really need you with me right now. I was able to hold Susan's gaze for only a moment. Then my eyes fell towards the board. The planchette started to slide along the board and spelled out the word, love. Just that word had tears streaming out of both eyes. I couldn't believe that I had waited so long to do this, and all out of stubborn disbelief. For the next 15 minutes I waited, until Evelyn confirmed to me that she was okay and that she was sorry that she had left so abruptly. She apologized for the way it happened, but she had came to accept that it was her time and hoped I could do so as well. Her final message to me is what was the most impactful. It came as a single word, but I knew immediately what it meant. Forever was the word she told me. Evelyn was letting me know that no matter how long we were apart, that our love would last an eternity. I believed her wholeheartedly. I know now I'll see my love again. Our time hasn't come to an end, but rather been put on a pause.
7.
A few years ago, I went to a psychic medium in hopes of contacting my dad's spirit. He had died when I was young, and I was seeking out his approval for the choices I'd made in my life, especially those as a parent. He'd done so much for us, and I tried to walk in his footsteps, if not fill his shoes. Even though I was told that there were no guarantees that he would make himself known, I had high hopes that he would come forward. We'd always shared a strong connection while he was alive, and I was sure he'd answer my call, even after all the time that had passed. The woman had in fact been able to give me some messages, but when the time for the session ended, I found myself wanting to ask more questions. Now that I had established his willingness to make contact, I felt comfortable trying to seek out answers on my own. I don't possess any psychic abilities of my own, so I was relegated to using a Ouija board in hopes of communicating with my departed father. Even though I was a firm believer in the spiritual realm, I had my hopes as to the power of a mass-produced item such as the one I was going to use. I reached out and asked my mother and sister to aid in my goals. I figured that soliciting people that were close to him would only help draw him to us. Both of them were also believers in the supernatural and had been the ones who suggested I seek the help of the medium in the first place. So when I asked for the help, they were quick to agree. We agreed to meet at my mom's house. Again, a choice based on it was the same place where I grew up and the last place Dad called home. After a quick discussion, we chose Saturday night as the time in which all of us would attempt to contact him. After we hung up, it was like time decided to move at half speed. Work seemed to drag on, and the television shows that I normally found escape through seemed to not be able to hold my interest. The possibility of talking to my dad again seemed to have taken up residence in my mind, and nothing could distract me for more than a moment or two. Despite its best attempt, the week did finally come to an end, and the three of us were sitting around my mom's dining room table. We turned off all the lights in the room and lit a few candles that we had gathered from various parts of the house. The board sat out on the table, waiting for us to begin. I had to admit, even if we weren't able to make contact with my dad, the room definitely looked the part for what we planned on doing that night. Unbidden, a tremor passed through me. We were here with the best of intentions, but I had to admit, the atmosphere was more than a little creepy. Before we began, my mom placed the ring she gave him when they were married on the board. This had been planned in order to help draw him to us. Afterwards, all of us placed our hands on top of the planchette and stated to the spirits of the house that we were closing this gathering to any spirits who meant us any harm. Next, we moved the pointer in a circular pattern and said that we were reaching out to the spirit of my dad. I sat there with my fingers lightly on the planchette while my eyes bore holes through the board in front of me. My eyes started to burn as I refused to blink, fearing that I might miss the slightest hint that he was here with us. Seconds continued to tick by, but nothing happened. I felt my hope beginning to wane. I distinctly remember thinking, this is what I got for believing this piece of cardboard and plastic would let me talk to my dad. I started to feel a tightening in my chest, and my heart began to beat noticeably faster. When the planchette first moved, it was so slight, I almost thought I imagined it. Then it moved again, and I had to hold back a gasp. Hope bloomed in me for an instant, then threatened to extinguish just as fast when I looked at the two other women with me. They were so focused on what was happening that I didn't think there was any way they could have done it themselves. The pointer moved smoothly over the board as it selected 6 letters: F-A-M-I-L-Y. When it concluded the final letter, I felt a tear run down my cheek. Too overcome with emotion, my sister asked the only question that mattered at the point. "Dad, is that you?" The planchette didn't hesitate for a moment before it made its way over to yes. I asked him if he was okay, and the device made a circle back to the word yes. For the next hour, it was like we were having a conversation, although it was in an unconventional manner. Dad continued to assure us that he was always with us, especially in the most important parts of our lives. He even thanked my sister for naming her 4-month-old son after him. This revelation brought about quiet sobs from her, which required a stoppage until she could regain her composure. The emotions of the experience were taking their toll on all of us. I could have sat there at the table for hours, but my body was already begging for sleep. Mom especially looked like she was about to fall asleep where she sat. I told my dad that we were going to go, but wanted him to know that we missed him dearly and loved him very much. That is when the most amazing part of the evening happened. "I love you." It was only a whisper, but I still knew the sound of my dad's voice. My eyes shot open, and for a moment, all of the fatigue I'd been feeling suddenly vanished. The voice had been so quiet, and I almost didn't believe that it had actually happened. I looked up and saw startled expressions on my mom and sister's faces. I wanted to tell them what had happened, but I couldn't bring myself to speak, but doing so felt like a betrayal. This was a message just for me and me alone. I like to believe that all of us received a similar message that night. It was a moment of healing and closure for all of us. Dad was taken from all of us far too soon, and it was his way of telling us that he is proud and loves all of us. Since that night, we've tried to contact his spirit, but the planchette has remained still. If the whisper he spoke in my ear is the last thing I hear from my dad, I can't think of anything that I would have wanted to hear more.
6.
While I was still in high school, I kind of went through a goth phase. I don't really know what the cause of it was. Maybe I was dealing with some depression or just normal teenage angst. But something about the lifestyle called to me. I had gone all in on it, the makeup, literature, new friends. My parents were supportive of my new choices, although it probably killed my mom to do so. One night, me and one of my friends were spending the night at her house when she brought out a Ouija board. While reading, I had heard of these things before and the power that they possessed if used. When she asked me if I wanted to try it, I quickly jumped at the chance. The supernatural had always interested me, even before my shift to goth. Erica turned off all the lights in her room and lit a couple of black candles that she told me she had for just this type of thing. Right from the beginning, we started receiving messages, most of which were mundane things, random names and numbers that didn't seem to have any meaning. It was when we started asking things about our future when they started to take a darker turn. I had just finished asking what the name of the guy I would marry. The planchette seemed content to move in a slow, circular pattern on the board without spelling anything out. I looked up at Erica to see if she had something to ask. My eyes froze. Her eyes had rolled back, and the only thing I could see was the white parts. Even though she seemed to be in some sort of a daze, her mouth was forming words, though she wasn't actually speaking. A movement behind her caught my attention, and I saw what looked like her shadow growing up towards the ceiling. Fear clouded my judgment, and it took me a moment to figure out what I was supposed to do. I quickly moved the pointer towards the goodbye part of the board. The flames of the candles flicked slightly, and Erica seemed to collapse to her side. For a moment, I thought she had died. She was so still, and her face was even paler than before, which, given her already pallor skin, was terrifying. Then her chest rose and fell, and I was able to release a breath I didn't even know I was holding. She was at least alive, and at that moment, that was all I cared about. She came to slowly at first, but once her eyes opened up, she recovered really quickly. Erica told me she remembered feeling really cold all of a sudden, and the next thing she was waking up on the floor of her bedroom. Once I got her settled into her bed and she had fallen asleep, I excused myself and drove home. I arrived shortly before midnight. The emotions of the evening had drained me, and I was asleep moments after I crawled into bed. Exhaustion didn't save me from the fitful dreams that plagued me, though. I saw Erica with her eyes rolled back into her skull, but this time I could hear her speaking a strange language as she swayed back and forth. I woke up screaming, my throat hoarse from the strain. I didn't know how long I'd been doing it, but I was surprised the noise hadn't roused my parents to at least check on me. When I looked towards my door, I noticed a robed figure that stood about 3 or 4 feet tall, staring at me. It didn't have any features, just a general shape that was formed out of the shadows themselves. I went to scream for help when I felt an incredible force pin me down onto the bed. The weight of it was so great, I felt like I couldn't breathe. My muscles struggled to contract, allowing me to take in the necessary oxygen, but I wasn't strong enough. My lungs were burning, and my vision was starting to tunnel. A high-pitched buzzing sound seemed to be coming from everywhere. I'm going to die. I was absolutely sure of it. I had no way of fighting this thing in front of me. Just before I lost consciousness, the weight suddenly came off me. I sucked in a deep breath. The air was cold, and it burned on the way down. I didn't care, though. I was so desperate to breathe that I welcomed the sensation. After a few minutes, the ringing sound faded from my ears, and I didn't feel like I was going to suffocate right there in my bed. The figure at the end of my bed was almost gone, like it hadn't been there at all. If it weren't for the fact I'd almost died, I would have questioned whether I'd seen something or if it was just a hallucination. The only thing that I think could have brought the robed figure to my room was the Ouija board. We'd opened ourselves up to communicating with things that didn't belong in our world. It was us that were to blame. We let it in.
5.
The fallen angel. For as long as I can remember, I have been interested in him. When I was younger, I had numerous experiences I could not explain that got me thinking one thing: Lucifer. My family had just moved into a new house. I was in my room doing my homework, and I heard my name being called. It sounded like my mom, so I went downstairs and said, "Yeah?" She looked at me all weird and said, "Yeah, what?" "You called me. What do you want?" She shook her head no. "I didn't call you. I was doing dishes." I shrugged it off and went back upstairs. Only thing is, this happened until I moved out at 18. After a while, I just quit answering when my name was called. I was in bed one night. I was having a somewhat disturbing dream. When I awoke, I was pinned to the bed. I could not see anything there, but I felt pinned as if something would not let me up. I have read on this and am aware of sleep paralysis, so it is possible that maybe that's what it was. But I wasn't, and I can't forget how it felt. Not like being paralyzed. It felt like something was holding my arms and legs in place. I had a friend over because we were doing an assignment together in high school English class. We were studying in my room, and I had to go to the bathroom. When I got back, she was all nervous looking and as white as a sheet. I asked her what was wrong, and she said she heard whispering while I was gone, coming from my closet. Needless to say, she left without telling me what any of the whispers said. I still do not know to this day. Another friend of mine I confided in, they were into horror stuff and the paranormal, so I figured if anyone could give me answers or direction, Sarah could. Sarah came over for a sleepover and brought her Ouija board so we could attempt to contact the spirits that seemed to be haunting me. Once we started asking questions, I started to get nervous. Some of the answers were raising the hair on my arms and causing me to sweat. Should I be doing this? Am I opening a door I will not know how to close? I wish those thoughts went through my mind that night, but they did not. Is there anyone here with us? Yes. Are you a spirit? No. Are you a demon? Yes. Are your intentions bad? No. Are you lying? Yes. What is your name? Kilpin. Kilpin? Is this what we should call you? Yes. Do you call my friend's name? Yes. Why? No answer. Did you pin my friend to the bed? No. Then who did? A bunch of random letters that meant nothing. You are lying. It was you, wasn't it? Yes. Did you ever whisper in my friend's closet? No. Then who did? A bunch of random letters that meant nothing. You are a liar. It was you, wasn't it? Yes. Why are you here? No answer. Are you Lucifer? The planchette started going to yes, but instead fell down to goodbye. We figured that was that. Demon was done talking. Did I feel much better after this session? No. If anything, I felt like it brought up more questions. Was there really a demon in my house? And if so, why did he like messing with me? I thought back over my entire life. There was nothing I had done to anyone to deserve a demon attaching itself to me. Sarah and I put the board on top of my bed while we sat beside my bed on the floor talking about boys from school. After about 10 minutes, the board fell off the bed almost right into our laps. We stared at each other, both of our mouths open wide. I put that board in the middle of my bed, I said. So it shouldn't have been able to fall off, she finished for me. I nodded. Should we try again? She asked. Maybe it wants to talk some more. Again, we sat around the board and waited. Did you want to talk with us? Yes. What is your name? No response. We would like to know your name so we can call you by it when we ask questions. No. Sarah shivered heavily, then looked over her left shoulder. Are you breathing on my neck? Yes. She looked at me, her eyes wide, and my heart started pumping so loudly I thought she could hear it too. What do you want to talk about? Lock. What about a lock? No response. I don't understand what lock means. No response. Then I felt like something was touching the back of my shirt, like the feeling when a breeze picks up at it, just softly sways with it. Are you touching my back? No. Are you breathing on my back? Yes. Sarah and I exchanged glances. I was pretty much done with it all at that point. If it could breathe on me, I didn't want to know what else it could do. But Sarah wasn't done yet. Give us a sign that you're in the room with us. No response. Okay then, I guess we're going to say goodbye. A clank against my headboard. We stared at each other. We decided it best to say goodbye, and we did. After that night, I still had the occasional paranormal thing happen, but not as many as before. So I don't know if by having that conversation with whatever it was calmed things down or what. I was never pinned down to my bed again after that night. I also never heard the phantom voices calling my name either. Some say as you age, the paranormal doesn't affect you as much as when you were a child, so maybe that's it? I grew up and things just quit happening as much. Recently, my husband and I had a few friends over for a night of wine and binging some episodes on HBO. We had dropped our son off at my mom's house so we could stay up late and be a little rowdy without a risk of keeping him up all night. It had been a while since I had had a kid-free night, and I was looking forward to it. Unfortunately, luck wasn't on our side. Thunderstorms had blown into the area, and a transformer nearby ended up getting struck by lightning. The power was cut off, and we had a decision to make as to what the rest of our evening would consist of. We were about to call it a night when I brought up the idea of bringing out an old Ouija board that I had. Everyone else seemed like they were game, so we pulled out some candles to set the mood, and I grabbed the board out of the closet. The whole thing seemed a little silly. We weren't teenagers anymore. This was the kind of thing we should have outgrown a long time ago, believing in ghosts and demons. Still, when I sat there and looked at the planchette sitting there in the middle, I couldn't suppress the shiver that passed through me. There was a number of occasions that were more than a little creepy when I used boards just like this in the past. All four of us placed our hands on the planchette and moved it around in a circular pattern while stating that we were looking to make contact with any spirits who were wanting to speak with us. All of a sudden, the device jerked up towards the word no. I looked around and saw my husband smiling, and I knew that he'd moved the pointer intentionally. I gave him a kick in the shin under the table and told him to be serious. We returned our hands to the positions, and I asked again if there were any spirits out there that wanted to talk to us. The planchette moved to the word yes and stopped. My eyes shot toward my husband, expecting he had moved it again, but he just shook his head. My friends also gave me a similar response. I knew I hadn't moved it, so I went on with the next question. I asked what the name of the spirit whom we were communicating with was. It spelled out Tyler. We went on to ask a few more questions, like when he died and how it happened, but all we ever got was random letters that never seemed to make any sense. If this was a spirit we were communicating with, it just didn't seem to be able to give us any answers we could understand. Because of this, our interest in continuing quickly waned, and we told the spirit goodbye. The next day, my husband went over to my mom's to pick up our son, and I went to run a few errands. After a few hours, I got back, and my husband was in the living room watching some sort of sporting event on television, and I could hear my son upstairs. I could hear him talking and figured maybe one of his friends had come over to the house. I asked my husband who he was talking to, and his response was that he'd been up there talking to himself for almost an hour now. For some kids, this would have been normal, but not our son. If he was playing by himself, he tended to be quiet. I wanted to say hello to him and make sure he was okay since I hadn't seen him since the night before, so I went upstairs to his room. Not only was he sitting there talking to himself, but he didn't have any toys out. He was just sitting there, facing one of the corners to his room. I can't tell you how much this behavior upset me. He was 7 years old, still within the stages where he could have an imaginary friend, but he was an outgoing young boy with a lot of friends at school. Because of this type of thing seemed out of place. I walked in, and he didn't seem to notice I was there. He just sat there with his back to me, totally engrossed in the corner. "Hi, Mom." I stopped a few steps from him. I didn't know how he had known I was even there. I hadn't said anything to him, but it was possible he assumed it was me from the garage door opening. "Hey, Sammy, what are you doing up here?" I asked him. He finally turned around to look at me. "Nothing." "Who are you talking to?" I asked him to get to the point. "My new friend," he said. At that point, I just assumed he had created an imaginary friend. "Does your friend have a name?" He gave me a big grin. "His name is Tyler." Something about that particular name gave me pause. I knew I had heard it somewhere, but I couldn't place it for a few seconds. Suddenly, the pieces to the puzzle seemed to lock into place, and I remembered the name from the Ouija board the night before. The spirit had said its name was Tyler. Now, my son was telling me that he was talking to an imaginary friend with the same name. I left him in his room and went down to talk with my husband about what Sammy had told me. He brushed it off, just as a coincidence, but I wasn't satisfied with that response. The idea that I invited something into our home that was now talking to our son left a sinking feeling in my stomach. Over the next week, Sammy continued to talk to Tyler more and more. By day 7, both my husband and I had caught him awake in the middle of the night talking to a seemingly empty room. Every time, though, he would claim to be talking to his friend Tyler. When I asked him to draw a picture of Tyler for me, he told me that it was against the rules and he had promised not to let anyone know what Tyler looked like. When he went to school, though, I went through his room and found some disturbing drawings of a large black shape that seemed to be wearing a top hat. That was the day I made an appointment with a child psychologist for the following afternoon. When we went, he asked to leave him alone with Sammy. As much as I wanted to hear what was being said, I agreed. After about 15 minutes, he came back and told me that he believed that Sammy created Tyler in response to an unknown issue at school. I wasn't so sure. I scheduled another appointment for a couple of weeks from that day and thanked him for his time. We continued to go see the doctor for a few months, but Tyler remained a constant presence in our house. At this point, I'm starting to worry that he may never leave my son alone. The real worry is that Sammy doesn't seem to want him to. When he calls Tyler his best friend, it sends a chill through my entire body.
3,
My 4 friends and I were spending the night together in order to celebrate Christina's birthday. Her parents had gone to stay at a hotel for the evening, so the 5 of us could have the house to ourselves, so we didn't have that feeling of them watching over us constantly. We ordered some sushi and rented some horror flicks in hopes of scaring ourselves a little bit. After watching one of the movies, all of us realized we had seen far too many of these types of films. The stories may be different, but in the end, too many of them were predictable. Part of being scared is the unknown or the possibility that it could actually happen. Christina must have been reading my mind because all of a sudden, she flicked off the movie. This is boring. There was quiet noises of accent around the room. What was the point of having a house to yourself if you didn't take advantage of it? None of us were into drinking, not that we were old enough anyways, and we didn't really have any good ideas to go anywhere. Carly all of a sudden got a look in her eye. Hold on a second, I'll be right back. She walked out the front door, leaving the rest of us looking at each other, confused. When she came back, she was holding a box against her chest. I thought maybe tonight we could try this. She turned the box around and I could see that it was a Ouija board. I had never tried one before and hadn't ever planned on it either. I wasn't into the occult and thought that the stories I had heard about these things were just made up. I seemed to be the only one, though, since the others were quick to agree. Christina went and grabbed some candles and the 5 of us circled around the board. The instructions said that we had to all place a hand onto the planchette and make a figure 8 with it 5 times to begin. After doing this, we waited for it to move. The planchette didn't move, though. It just sat there in the middle of the board. I think we're supposed to ask it a question, Jessica said. The most obvious one seemed to be whether a spirit was there with us. When we asked, though, nothing happened. My beliefs of these things were quickly becoming confirmed as a hoax, but I was willing to play along for the sake of my friends. They asked question after question, only to be ignored by any spirits, real or otherwise, in the house. I could tell that everyone was getting frustrated. I'd already thought this was going to be a waste of time when all of a sudden the planchette started to slide in a slow, jerky fashion across the board. My first thought was that this was one of the other girls doing this in order to have something happen. After all, there hadn't been any movement for the last 20 minutes. I looked up, trying to figure out who was the one moving it by their faces, but they seemed as perplexed as I was. The only thing I knew for sure is I wasn't the one pushing it. I watched as it spelled out random letters that didn't seem to make any sense. Then the pointer went back to the center of the board and stopped. All of us looked at each other, but none of us spoke for a few seconds. Finally, Trina broke the silence. "Okay, which one of you did that?" To her question, all four of us shook our heads that we didn't. "Well, it wasn't me," she said quietly. Since the planchette had moved, there had been a strange feeling in the pit of my stomach, a heaviness that had yet to abate. Carly asked again if someone was there, and the pointer moved slowly to the word yes. One of the girls let out a nervous giggle, but I didn't see who it was. I was starting to get a little freaked out. This was supposed to be fun, but it didn't feel fun. It felt like someone was standing right behind me, hovering just over my shoulder. Christina asked if this thing that was speaking to us was dead. That is when the planchette pointed to no. The answer was confusing. I didn't know how a spirit could be communicating with us if it wasn't dead. Jessica asked what its name was, after which it pointed to no. "You won't tell us your name? Is that what you're saying?" she asked. The planchette started making large circles. It moved faster and faster, which I took for this spirit getting angry. Finally, it stopped suddenly on the word yes. The fact that it wouldn't tell us a name felt like a bad sign. What reason would it have to keep this from us? The bad feeling in my stomach had only intensified. I hadn't yet spoken a question, but there was something that I felt compelled to ask. I was afraid to know the answer, though. Before I could chicken out, I blurted it out. "Where are you?" The planchette started making fast circles again, and then started to spell out the letters. I-N. H-E-L-L. I-N. H-E-L-L. I-N. H-E-L-L. Over and over again, it spelled the same letters out. It moved from one to the next, faster and faster, until it was all we could do to keep our hands on the device. Finally, it moved back to the center of the board and stayed still. The pause almost felt worse than the motion. The feeling of something looming over the top of me was almost unbearable. Christina started to ask a question. "Are you saying you're a demon?" Even before the word demon could be spoken, a loud bang came from somewhere behind her. It came so suddenly that all of us pulled our hands away from the planchette. All of us looked around, but none of us indicated that we saw anything. "We have to say goodbye," Carly said to all of us. I could tell she was afraid. Frankly, I was way past that. I reached out with the others and touched the device. It started making angry circles again, obviously upset by our intention to stop talking to it. Undeterred, though, we all said goodbye at the same time, and the planchette stopped. The five of us sat there quietly trying to figure out what to say about what just happened. Was it a demon that had contacted us, or was it just our subconscious minds moving it? Either way, I was done playing with the board and messing around with powers I didn't understand. If I never see one of those boards again, it would be fine by me.
2.
A few years ago, me and a couple of friends moved into an apartment together. All of us were going to college, and it was a way for the three of us to save a little money on our living expenses, and at least we would know the people who shared the house with me. It took us about a month, but finally we found a house that all of us could afford, and shortly thereafter the rental agreement was signed. From the very beginning of us living there, strange things would seem to happen. Doors would open and close on their own. Strange knocking sounds could be heard during various times of day. Even our personal possessions would go missing, only to show up in places where they hadn't been before. At first, we chalked these things up to forgetfulness or strange pressure changes in the house. Sure, there was the occasional joke that we had inherited a ghostly roommate when we moved in, but those comments were all in jest. As time went on, the occurrences seemed to happen more often. The doors wouldn't just click shut, but slam closed when one of us was alone. This was also about the time when I started to get the feeling like somebody was always following me, no matter where I went while I was home. As soon as I'd leave, the sensation would dissipate, only to return when I did. We'd even stopped making the lighthearted comments about a ghost in the house. With everything that was going on, none of us thought it was funny. My grades had begun to slip in my classes, and my relationships with my friends and family had suffered as well. My mom had constantly been asking me if something was wrong, but I didn't really know how to break the news to her that I thought my house was haunted. She didn't believe in such things, and I wasn't in the mood for a lecture on stress management. Things had come to a head when we were taking midterms. We still had 8 months left on our lease, but the prospect of paying a penalty was something we had all discussed in order to escape whatever was going on. Even with all of us living there, money was still somewhat tight, and the amount we'd have to pay felt daunting. That is, when Greg suggested we try using a Ouija board in order to see if there was something that could be done to help whatever this spirit was leave the house. This option seemed reasonable, but there was a part of me that hesitated before readily agreeing to it. I had heard stories where using a Ouija board had made things worse. So far, none of us had been physically hurt. It had been contained to just noises, doors moving on their own, and the feeling of being watched. Still, it was unnerving, and I was getting to my wits' end. Finally, I agreed that it was something we should try. The next day, Greg went out and bought the Ouija board, but we didn't immediately jump into it. I think the three of us were having second thoughts as to what could happen if we took the next step. After a particularly upsetting night where the activity had kept us all awake the entire night, we finally decided the time had come to either do something about it or leave. That night, the three of us sat around our kitchen table with the board sitting between us. There was part of me that still didn't want to do this. There was a part of me that expected the planchette to start moving on its own with all the activity we had experienced while we had lived there. Maybe I was just hoping it would, so I didn't have to touch it. It felt like by touching it, we would be crossing a line from which we couldn't go back from. Despite my better judgment, all of us put our hands on the pointer and moved it around in a circle like we were instructed to do. I didn't know how long we were supposed to wait for something to happen, but as soon as I asked if there were any spirits who wanted to communicate with us, it immediately went to yes. If I hadn't seen and heard all that I had in the past few months, I would have been sure one of the other two had moved it themselves. Now, though, I didn't even question what was happening. We asked a few basic questions and established that we were communicating with the spirit of an elderly woman who claimed to have died in the house. When we asked her if she was the only one who was there in the house, the planchette rushed to the word, no. The next question we asked her was, is the other entity here with us? In which she responded, no. Greg was the next to ask, is the other spirit evil? When the pointer slid immediately to the word yes, a chill went down my spine. This was what I had been afraid of. I had always suspected this was the case, but to have it confirmed only made me dislike what had been happening that much more. I no longer could trust that the thing we were talking to wasn't the evil entity itself. What would stop it from lying to us in order to deceive us? Knowing we were dealing with something evil, we started asking questions about what it was and its name. We didn't get any real answers to these questions, but were able to establish that it would hurt us if it could. There was one final question that I felt needed to be asked. If we were going to still live here, we needed to know if there was a way to get this evil spirit to leave. What are we supposed to do? I asked. The planchette moved and began to spell G-E-T-O-U-T. It continued to say the same thing, even when we tried asking something else. It continued to tell us to get out of the house. With no other answers seemingly coming, we closed the session by moving the pointer to goodbye. Even though this wasn't the answer we wanted, it was an answer. The next day, the three of us informed the landlord we would be leaving and were aware that we'd have to pay the penalty for doing so. Honestly, it was the best $1,000 I'd ever spent. So far, it doesn't appear that the evil spirit has followed any of us to our new places, and I can only hope it stays that way. When we were kids back in the 90s, we heard the stories of demons and possessions and evil entities coming through Ouija boards. We didn't believe that by any means they could be real. I mean, how is a board supposed to let in a demon? So, naturally, a few of my friends and I got a Ouija board and wanted to try our luck at contacting a spirit. Amy, Jen, Trevor, and I sat around the board. We read the instructions out loud and began to follow the steps. We seemed to contact a spirit named Mickey. I honestly thought someone was making this up because the name was part of a popular cartoon. Mickey seemed to not like me at all. Because we all still weren't convinced this was an actual spirit and not one of us moving the planchette, we decided to make Mickey talk to me even though he didn't want to. We all brought our hands to the planchette. Mine were the closest, and when they came within an inch of it, the planchette moved to the other side of the board. Everyone's hands were above the board, so it could not have been a magnet. It gave me chills. After that, the planchette refused to move for any of us. So, instead of all of us, we took turns trying to calm Mickey down. Jen got on it first. Mickey said he was angry. He told us to listen. We all sat there in silence for a minute or two, then shrugged it off. Listen for what? That's when the phone on the wall rang. No joke. We all stared at it as it rang and rang and rang. Then, after over 10 rings, Amy nudged me. "Go answer it," she instructed. I took a deep breath, got off the carpet, and walked over to the phone. By now, it was on its 20th ring. Who would be calling that would be willing to let it ring so long? I pulled the receiver from its cradle and listened. The others huddled around me in a circle trying to overhear. On the other hand, it was static, except what sounded like bugs, like thousands of bugs scrabbling around. Then it sounded as if something was trying to whisper something through the static, but we were unable to understand it. I hung up the phone. We all just stared at each other, silent. "Well," Jen said, picking up her bag, "I think I'm going to head home." "Yeah, me too," said Amy. Trevor paused after the others left. He seemed to look guilty. "You going to be okay by yourself?" I looked around the room. "Yeah, my parents will be home soon." He grabbed up his bag and waved. "Okay, see you at school on Monday." "Bye." I watched out the window as they all walked down the street. Outside, the sun was setting and the street lamps were just illuminating the darkness. I turned to face the living room and the board that still sat on the coffee table. I drew in a deep breath and willed myself forward. When I reached the board, I paused before putting it back in its box. I guess some part of me expected the planchette to move wildly about, but it didn't. I tucked it away in the closet behind some of my soccer stuff and went upstairs to get ready for bed. I wish I could say that I played with it after that, but I never did. And when I moved out for college and was rifling through my stuff, I came across it again. I put it up for free on Craigslist. I just left it by our front door and put "free, U-Haul." And by the end of the day, someone had picked it up. Sometimes I wonder if the person who picked it up had anything wild happen to them. Was Mickey attached to the board and he was a package deal for the new owner? I'll never know. But what I do know is whenever I see anyone post about how fun playing with a Ouija board is, I make sure to comment and tell them how wrong they are. I don't get into my experience. I just say they are evil. From my experience, they are.